The Millionaire CEO's forced to marry his assistant to secure a business deal, but he never expect. The towering glass windows of Diego Castillo's penthouse office overlooked the sprawling skyline of Buenos Aires, Argentina. The city buzzed with life below, tango music drifting through open cafe doors, cobblestone streets alive with chatter. But at this moment, his attention was far from the breathtaking view. His sharp brown eyes were locked onto the stack of legal documents in front of him, his jaw tightening with every word that left his lawyer's mouth. "This is absurd," Diego spat, shoving the papers away. His voice was sharp, edged with disbelief and frustration. "You're telling me that in order to finalize the Castillo-Hernandez merger, I need to be married?" Victor Morales, his ever-composed attorney, adjusted his glasses and nodded. "Yes, Roberto Hernandez has made it clear. He will only proceed with the deal if he sees you as a stable, family-oriented man. He believes a CEO who is married demonstrates commitment and responsibility, qualities he values in a business partner." Diego let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "So my ability to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation means nothing unless I have a ring on my finger. That's the most archaic nonsense I've ever heard." Victor sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Archaic or not, he holds the keys to the deal, and we both know securing this merger is essential for the company's future." Diego exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the mahogany desk. He wasn't the kind of man to be backed into a corner, but this was a ridiculous demand. Relationships weren't his thing, let alone marriage. A movement in the corner of the room caught his eye. His gaze landed on Isabella Ruiz, his executive assistant of 5 years. She had been silently taking notes as always, her expression unreadable. Unlike most people who cowered under his intense scrutiny, Isabella held his gaze, her dark eyes steady. Diego leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was competent, intelligent, and most importantly, single. A thought formed, so outrageous yet so logical that it made perfect sense. He sat forward, fingers interlacing as he looked directly at her. "You're not married, are you, Isabella?" Isabella blinked at the abrupt question, momentarily thrown off. "No? Why?" A slow, calculating smirk formed on Diego's lips. "Then marry me." A sharp silence filled the office. Victor nearly dropped his pen. Isabella's eyes widened. What?" "Marry me," Diego repeated, his tone completely serious. "It's a simple arrangement, a contract. We get married, Hernandez is satisfied, the deal goes through, and after a year, we go our separate ways. No complications." Isabella let out a startled laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Diego asked coolly, her stomach twisted. No, he definitely wasn't joking. Isabella straightened her shoulders, taking a deep breath. "Diego, I work for you. This is insane. You can't just propose to your assistant because of a business deal." Diego leaned forward, his piercing gaze unwavering. "Why not? It's a simple exchange. I get what I need, and in return—" He paused, calculating his next move. "I'll pay off your father's medical debt." Isabella's breath hitched. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to steady herself. That wasn't fair. He knew exactly how to push her buttons. "I don't play fair," Diego said smoothly. "You know that." She swallowed hard. Her father's hospital bills had been piling up for months, suffocating her with each reminder. No matter how many extra hours she worked, the debt loomed over her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Diego must have noticed her hesitation because he pressed on. "Think about it, Isabella. 1 year of marriage, no real strings attached. In return, your father gets the best medical care, and you walk away debt-free. It's a business arrangement, one that benefits us both." Isabella bit her lip, her mind racing. Every logical fiber in her body screamed at her to refuse. But then she thought about her father's weary smile, the exhaustion in his eyes, every time he said he didn't want to be a burden. Was it really so different from any other sacrifice she'd made for her family? She exhaled sharply. And there would be rules? Diego smirked slightly, sensing victory. Of course. You'd keep your job, your independence, no physical expectations, no emotional entanglements, just a marriage on paper. Isabella felt her pulse pounding in her ears. This was insane, completely insane. But maybe, just maybe, it was her only choice. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Isabella's heart pounded as she looked at Diego, the man who had been her boss for 5 years. The man she had always seen as untouchable, ruthless, and completely out of her league. And now he was asking her to marry him. Isabella took a deep breath. 1 year, she said firmly. That's it? Diego nodded. 1 year. We keep it private, Isabella continued, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. No unnecessary media attention. I don't want my personal life turned into some corporate gossip piece. That can be arranged, Diego replied smoothly. She hesitated, then added, and no intimacy. A smirk tugged at Diego's lips, but before he could respond, Victor cleared his throat. The lawyer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. If you two are seriously considering this, I'll need to draft the contract immediately. Isabella felt a strange weight settle in her chest. She had just agreed to something that went against every logical instinct she had. But deep down, a small voice whispered, You didn't have a choice, did you? Diego stood, adjusting his cufflinks with his usual ease. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand toward her, waiting for her to shake on the deal. Her fingers trembled slightly as she placed her hand in his. The moment their hands touched, a shiver ran down her spine. She ignored it. This wasn't real. This was business. As they shook on it, Diego's gaze darkened with something unreadable. This will change everything, he said softly. Isabella swallowed hard, already knowing that he was right. And just like that, the contract was sealed. The wedding was quick, efficient, and completely devoid of romance, just as Diego had planned. Held in a private courthouse in Buenos Aires, with only Victor, a judge, and a couple of witnesses present, the entire event was over in less than 20 minutes. No grand ceremony, no white dress, no emotional vows, just signatures on a legally binding contract. Isabella stood across from Diego in a simple beige dress, her heart hammering as she repeated the words, I do, in a voice that barely sounded like her own. Diego's deep voice followed, steady and confident, as if he were sealing a business deal rather than pledging a lifetime commitment. A brief kiss, barely a brush of lips, impersonal and cold. And just like that, she was now Mrs. Castillo. But the secrecy didn't last long. By the time they stepped out of the courthouse, cameras were already flashing, journalists swarming. Someone had leaked the story, and within hours the entire internet was ablaze with the shocking news. Billionaire CEO Diego Castillo secretly marries his assistant. A corporate Cinderella story or a gold-digging scheme? The headlines blared. The world didn't see the struggling daughter trying to pay off her father's medical debt. They saw nobody who had just married into wealth and power overnight. The comments were worse. She must be pregnant. No way a man like him would marry his assistant otherwise. Classic gold-digger move. Enjoy it while it lasts, sweetheart. He'll drop you the second he's bored. Isabella tried to ignore them. She told herself she didn't care what people thought. But the moment she saw the same disappointment in her father's eyes, the very look she had spent years trying to erase, something inside her cracked. Diego, on the other hand, remained completely unaffected. One evening, as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, he remarked coolly, "If you spend time worrying about what people think, you'll never get anywhere in life." Isabella wanted to scream. Of course he didn't care. He was Diego Castillo, powerful, untouchable. But she was the one being humiliated, scrutinized, and ripped apart by the world. She was the one losing herself in this farce of a marriage. And worst of all, he didn't care. The moment they moved into Diego's penthouse, reality hit her like a brick wall. The space was modern, sleek, and cold, just like him. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking view of Buenos Aires, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Diego was rarely home, and when he was, he treated her like she was invisible. He spoke to her only when necessary, answering in clipped, impersonal sentences. At first, Isabella tried to make it work. She tried to pretend that they could at least be cordial roommates. But he made it impossible. As Isabella lay awake in the cavernous bed that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, she realized something unsettling. Diego wasn't the only one keeping secrets. There were whispers in the company about Roberto Hernandez's true motives for demanding the marriage, and Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into a trap. The final straw came one evening at the Castillo Enterprises headquarters. Isabella had been sitting in on a board meeting, quietly taking notes as usual, when one of the senior executives, an older man with a patronizing smirk, leaned toward her. "So, Mrs. Castillo," he said mockingly, dragging out her new last name, "tell us, how does it feel to go from being a mere assistant to a billionaire's wife overnight? Quite the promotion, I'd say." A few chuckles echoed across the room. Isabella felt her cheeks burn as the weight of everyone's eyes settled on her. Some amused, some disapproving, all assuming the worst. She glanced at Diego, expecting some kind of defense, but he barely looked up from his laptop. That was it. Isabella straightened in her seat, her voice calm but firm. "I wouldn't call it a promotion," she said evenly. "I still do the same work and the same long hours. The only difference is that now I have to deal with people assuming I got here by accident rather than by ability." The room went silent. The executive coughed awkwardly, shifting in his seat. Diego finally looked up at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. For the first time since their marriage, he actually noticed her. But Isabella wasn't done. She turned toward Diego, her voice sharper this time. "And if my presence in these meetings is going to be reduced to gossip and condescending remarks, then perhaps I shouldn't be here at all." With that, she stood up, pushing back her chair, and walked out. For the rest of the evening, Diego didn't say a word to her. But the next morning, the same executive issued a formal apology, not just to her, but in front of the entire board. Isabella knew exactly who was behind it, and for the first time since their marriage, she realized something. Maybe Diego Castillo wasn't as indifferent as he pretended to be. The fever hit hard. Isabella barely made it through the front door of the penthouse before her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the couch, her head spinning, her entire body drenched in cold sweat. She hadn't been feeling well all day, but she had pushed through, as always. Between her workload at Castillo Enterprises and the constant scrutiny of the media, she had barely given herself time to breathe, let alone rest. Now her body was forcing her to stop. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. But at some point, a warm hand touched her forehead. A deep, familiar voice murmured, "Damn it, Isabella." Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the briefest moment, she saw Diego's face hovering over hers, his brows furrowed in uncharacteristic concern. She must have been hallucinating because there was no way Diego Castillo, The man who treated their marriage like a business deal was kneeling beside her with actual worry in his eyes. But the warmth of the blanket being draped over her, the feeling of a damp cloth pressed gently against her forehead, that was real. She woke up again in the middle of the night, her fever breaking, to find Diego sitting at the edge of the couch, his head resting against his hand, watching over her. Her voice hoarse, she whispered, "You stayed?" Diego looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, "Go back to sleep, Isabella." And for the first time in a long time, she felt safe enough to do just that. A week later, Isabella found herself at a lavish gala event, standing among Buenos Aires elite. Dressed in an elegant navy gown that Diego had picked out, she cut a striking figure. It was the kind of event she usually hated, filled with forced smiles, fake laughter, and whispers behind champagne glasses. But she had learned to endure it. Being Mrs. Castillo required playing the part. What she hadn't expected was the unwanted attention. "Mrs. Castillo," a smooth voice purred beside her. She turned to find Daniel Whitmore, a charming investor with a reputation for being both a playboy and a ruthless businessman. His dark eyes swept over her, his smirk lazy and amused. "You're even more stunning in person," he said smoothly, stepping closer. "I have to admit, when I heard Diego got married, I thought it was just another business move. But now that I see you," he tilted his head, "I can understand why he wouldn't want to share." Isabella's jaw tightened. She took a step back, her tone icy. "Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you keep your assumptions and your distance to yourself." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her defiance. "Feisty. I like that." Before Isabella could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air like steel. "Is there a problem here?" Diego stood a few feet away, his piercing gaze locked on Daniel. The tension in the room thickened instantly. Daniel smirked, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No problem at all, Castillo. Just admiring what's yours." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Isabella and Diego alone. Diego's eyes softened slightly as they met hers. "Are you all right?" Isabella hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." But as Diego placed a protective hand on her lower back, guiding her away from the crowd, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel Whitmore wasn't someone who backed down easily, and that this encounter was far from over. As the gala continued, Isabella noticed Daniel Whitmore lingering near the bar, his dark eyes following her every move. What she didn't know was that his interest in her wasn't just personal, it was professional. And Diego's reaction to him hinted at a deeper rivalry, one that could unravel everything Isabella thought she knew about her husband. She had dealt with men like him before, ones who assumed she was nothing more than a trophy wife. "I appreciate the compliment," Isabella said coolly, "but I don't believe my husband would appreciate this conversation." "Your husband?" Daniel chuckled, his smirk widening. "He's been talking business all night. Seems to me like you're alone." Just then, a strong hand gripped Isabella's waist, pulling her back against a familiar, solid chest. Diego's voice was lethal, ice cold. "Not alone, Whitmore." Daniel's smirk faltered. "Ah, Christian. I mean, Diego. Didn't see you there." Diego's grip tightened slightly, his voice calm but laced with a warning. "That's funny, Whitmore, because I saw you." A tense silence stretched between the three of them. Isabella's pulse raced, not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time, Diego Castillo wasn't indifferent. He was angry, possessive, jealous. Without another word, Diego grabbed her hand and led her out of the ballroom. When they reached the car, Isabella finally found her voice. "Diego, what the hell was that?" He didn't look at her as he loosened his tie, his jaw clenched. "He was flirting with you." Isabella crossed her arms. So what? This is just a contract marriage, remember? What does it matter to you? Diego said nothing because he didn't have an answer, and that terrified him. Days passed, but the tension between them didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse. Diego became distant again, burying himself in work, avoiding unnecessary interactions with her. Isabella should have been relieved. It was easier when he was cold and detached. But she wasn't. She was furious. And that fury finally boiled over one evening when she confronted him in his office. "You've been ignoring me," she accused, arms crossed. Diego barely glanced up from his paperwork. "I've been busy." "That's bull—" Her words cut off as his pen stilled. Slowly he lifted his gaze to hers. "Careful, Isabella." She let out a bitter laugh. "Why? Are you going to fire me?" "Oh, wait. You can't. I'm your wife." Something in his expression darkened. "You think this is a game?" She stepped closer, refusing to back down. "No, I think this is pathetic. One minute, you're pulling me out of a party like some jealous husband, and the next, you're acting like I don't exist." Diego pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, closing the distance between them. "You want me to act like your husband, Isabella? Because I don't think you'd like it if I did." Her breath caught in her throat. "Try me." And then he kissed her. Not gently, not carefully. It was hard, desperate, consuming, a battle of wills, a collision of everything they had been fighting against since the moment they signed the contract. Isabella's hands in his shirt, her body pressing into his as every nerve in her body ignited at once. But just as suddenly as it started, Diego pulled away. His breathing was heavy, his hands still gripping her waist. Then, as if realizing what he had done, he stepped back. His expression shut down, his voice hollow. This was a mistake. Isabella felt something inside her shatter. Before she could say anything, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone, confused, and painfully aware of just how much this marriage had changed. Isabella stared at her suitcase, her fingers trembling as she zipped it shut. The penthouse was silent. The only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It felt surreal how quickly everything had unraveled. One kiss, one stupid, reckless kiss, had changed everything. Diego had called it a mistake, and that was all she needed to know. She had spent weeks, months, convincing herself that she could handle this arrangement, that she could live under the same roof as him, pretend this marriage was just a business deal. But the truth was, she had fallen for him, and staying any longer would only break her further. She took a deep breath and lifted her bag, her heart hammering as she stepped toward the door. She didn't expect Diego to be there, but as soon as she turned the corner, she found him standing by the living room window, a whiskey glass in hand, staring out into the city lights. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "Going somewhere?" Isabella tightened her grip on her suitcase. "I'm leaving." Silence. Then slowly he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because I can't do this anymore." His brows furrowed, but his voice remained calm. "The contract isn't up yet." Isabella let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, come on, Diego. Are you really going to hold me to a contract after everything?" He said nothing. Isabella exhaled shakily. "This, whatever this is, it's not enough, and it never will be." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Panic, maybe, or something dangerously close to regret. But he didn't stop her. He didn't fight for her. And that hurt more than anything else. So she turned away, walked through the door, and didn't look back. Diego sat alone in his office, staring blankly at the stack of untouched documents on his desk. For the first time in his entire career, he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to Isabella, the way her voice had trembled when she said she was leaving, the way her eyes had searched his, almost begging him to give her a reason to stay. But he had let her go, because that was the safe thing to do. Because if he admitted what he really felt, everything would spiral out of control. A sharp knock pulled him from his thoughts. When Diego opened the door, he wasn't prepared for who stood on the other side, or the news they brought. Someone from Isabella's past had resurfaced, threatening to expose secrets that could destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. And now Diego faced a choice: step up and fight for her, or lose her forever. Victor Morales stepped inside, his usual composed expression replaced with something softer: pity. "You look like hell," Victor remarked, sitting down across from Diego. Diego scoffed. "Did you come here just to point that out?" Victor leaned back, studying him for a long moment before speaking. "You know, Diego, you've built an empire. You have everything a man could want: money, power, control." Diego's jaw tightened. "Get to the point," Victor sighed. "You have everything, but you've never known what it's like to lose something that truly matters." Diego's grip on his pen tightened. "I haven't lost anything." Victor raised a brow. "Haven't you?" A tense silence settled between them, and for the first time Diego felt it. That deep, gnawing emptiness in his chest. Because Isabella wasn't there anymore. Suddenly his penthouse felt too big, too quiet. And for the first time in his life, Diego Castillo realized he had made the biggest mistake of all. He had let the only woman who ever mattered walk away. Diego had always been a man of logic, control, and strategy. Emotions had no place in his world. But now he was a man haunted by the absence of the woman who had unknowingly become his world. At first, he tried to convince himself that if he just focused on work, he would forget about Isabella. It didn't work. Every time he walked into his penthouse, it felt empty. The coffee she used to make in the mornings was gone. The sound of her soft footsteps in the hallway, silence. The fire in her eyes whenever they argued, extinguished. He found himself replaying their moments together, searching for the exact second when he should have stopped her from leaving. And then one night, he found himself standing in front of her old apartment. He knocked. No answer. He called. Straight to voicemail. Isabella had shut him out completely. For the first time in his life, Diego Castillo had no control over the outcome, and it terrified him. Diego's downward spiral reached its peak when Victor stormed into his office, looking more exasperated than ever. "We have a problem," Victor said, tossing a folder onto Diego's desk. Diego barely glanced at it. "Not now." Victor slammed his hands onto the desk, forcing Diego to meet his gaze. "Yes, now. Hernandez knows you and Isabella aren't together anymore." Diego finally snapped to attention. "What?" Victor sighed. "He's not an idiot, Diego. He sees the headlines. Isabella hasn't been spotted at any events with you. People are talking. And now Hernandez is questioning whether this entire marriage was just a ploy to manipulate him into signing the merger." Diego exhaled sharply. "Is he pulling out?" "He's thinking about it," Victor said, then lowered his voice. "He wants to meet with you personally." Diego ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. A few months ago, this news would have terrified him. The Castillo-Hernandez merger was supposed to be the biggest business move of his career. But now he couldn't bring himself to care, because losing Isabella had already cost him more than this deal ever could. Victor studied him for a long moment before finally saying, "You have a choice, Diego. You can either fight for this deal, or you can fight for her. But I think we both know which one actually matters to you." Diego stared at him, and for the first time, the answer was crystal clear. The press conference had been scheduled to address the state of the merger. But as Diego stood at the podium, staring at the dozens of flashing cameras and reporters waiting for a statement, he knew this was his last chance to make things right. He took a deep breath, and then, against every business instinct, against every carefully crafted corporate script, he spoke from the heart. "I know many of you are expecting me to talk about the merger today," he began, his voice steady but laced with something raw, something real. "But I'm not here to talk about business." The room shifted. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Diego's grip on the podium tightened. "For the past few months, I've been telling myself that my marriage to Isabella Ruiz was just a contract, a necessity, a means to an end." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "But I was wrong." The murmurs grew louder. Reporters leaned forward, hanging on to every word. "I was wrong," Diego repeated, his voice breaking slightly. "Because somewhere along the way, she became more than just my wife on paper. She became everything." The room fell silent. Diego scanned the sea of faces, knowing the cameras were broadcasting his words to millions of people. But at that moment, there was only one person he wanted to reach. "Isabella," he said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "If you're watching this." As Diego's heartfelt confession aired live, Isabella sat in her small apartment in Buenos Aires, tears streaming down her face. She had sworn she was done with him, but hearing his voice, so raw and vulnerable, made her question everything. Before she could process her emotions, a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she found someone unexpected standing there. Roberto Hernandez, the man whose demands had started this entire chain of events, and he wasn't there to congratulate her. "I love you." Somewhere across the city, in a tiny apartment, Isabella dropped the remote. Tears filled her eyes as she watched the man who had once sworn off love bare his soul to the world. And for the first time in a long time, she believed him. Diego stood outside Isabella's apartment, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. Not in the boardroom, not during billion-dollar deals, not even during the most critical moments of his career. This was different. This was real. He knocked. No answer. For a brief, terrifying second, he thought she wouldn't open the door, that he had lost her for good. But then the lock clicked. The door creaked open. And there she was, Isabella. Her brown eyes were cautious, her expression guarded. But she was there, and she was listening. Diego dropped to one knee. Isabella's breath hitched. Diego reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. But this time, there were no contracts, no business negotiations, no ulterior motives. This time, it was real. "I don't deserve you," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that. I spent so much time pushing you away, convincing myself that love was a weakness, that what we had was nothing more than a deal." He swallowed hard. "But I was wrong. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life." Isabella's eyes glistened, her fingers trembling slightly as they covered her lips. Diego took a deep breath. "I love you, Isabella. Not because of a contract, not because of some business deal, but because you are the best damn thing that has ever happened to me." He opened the box, revealing a simple, yet stunning diamond ring. "I don't want a contract. I don't want a timeline. I just want you. Forever." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Marry me. For real this time." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she was nothing more than a temporary arrangement to him. But now here he was, a man who once refused to believe in love, on his knees begging her to be his. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across her lips. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Diego let out a shaky breath, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, before slipping the ring onto her finger. Then he stood cradling her face in his hands and kissed her. A real kiss, one filled with love, passion, and the promise of forever. And this time, when they held each other, there were no contracts, no conditions, only love. The Castillo penthouse was no longer just a house. It was a home. The once cold, impersonal space was now filled with warmth, soft laughter, the scent of fresh coffee in the mornings, framed photos on the walls that told their story, and in the center of it all, a tiny, giggling baby girl with Diego's piercing brown eyes and Isabella's warm smile. Diego sat on the couch, holding their daughter in his arms, completely mesmerized. "I never thought I'd have this," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. Isabella curled up beside him, smiling softly. "Have what?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "A family?" Isabella's heart swelled. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Well," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips, "now you do." As Diego held his wife and daughter close, he finally understood. Love had never been his weakness. It had been his greatest strength all along. Isabella never expected that a contract marriage would lead her to the greatest love of her life. And Diego, he never thought that letting go of control would be the very thing that saved him. Their journey wasn't perfect. It was messy, painful, and full of mistakes. But love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone again and again, even when things get hard. 1 year after that fateful deal, they stood together, not as business partners, not as strangers bound by paper, but as a real husband and wife. Their love had survived doubt, fear, and pride, and now it was stronger than ever. As Diego held their newborn daughter in his arms, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he had everything he ever needed. Love can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes what starts as a contract turns into something real. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Timeline Stories for more emotional, heartfelt tales that will move your soul. Because sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones we never see coming.